Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube station at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and this morning I am honored and delighted to welcome educator and writer Dag Scheer here to talk about her memoir, When Echoes Speak. Dag was born in Riga, Latvia, and in her memoir she examines the way that lives are shaped by memory, collective history, and the challenges of adapting to diverse cultures. In August of 1944, her family had to flee Latvia to escape the Soviet occupation, and they eventually settled in Cleveland, Ohio. After graduating from Miami University, Dag determined to find her own path, and she left home to live and work in many countries across the globe, as you'll hear about today. First off, Dag, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Dag. I so enjoyed reading your fascinating and beautifully written book, When Echoes Speak. And, you know, in your memoir and in your life, they're informed by this fundamental forced dislocation that you and your family experienced in your childhood. But I think a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with what happened in Latvia, your home country, during the Soviet occupation. And I'm not sure everybody knows what it means to be a displaced person. And so I was hoping that you might start us off by describing these circumstances of your early life and what it meant to be a refugee living in a displaced person's camp.
Yes. My book begins with a description of a scene from my childhood. And I was only 5 years old, but I remember it clearly.
Oh, I'll bet.
What happened is described as if seen through the eyes of a child. Mm-hmm. So that morning I woke up and I heard terrible commotion in the house. And I ran to find my mother. Mm-hmm. And in her room she was packing suitcases. Mm-hmm. And I ran in the kitchen and I saw my grandmother was taking food items from the pantry and piling them up on the kitchen table, loaves of bread and hard-boiled eggs and jars of strawberry jams. She took the ends of the tablecloth and tied it all together in a bundle. And somewhere in the house, my baby sister was crying, and nobody was picking her up. Mm. I didn't know what was happening.
Yeah.
I didn't know that my family was preparing to leave our home in Latvia. Latvia is a small country on the Baltic Sea with a turbulent history. It's been coveted and invaded by neighboring countries over the centuries. And the reason being because it has a strategic location. Mm. It has an ice-free port, and it's sort of a crossroads between East and West Europe. Yeah. So that morning in August of 1944, people all over Riga were packing up their precious belongings and leaving their home. Because, once again, the country was being invaded. Mm-hmm. And this time by the Soviet Union's Red Army that was approaching from the east. And that meant that Latvia would become a communist country.
Yeah.
And dreading what life might be like in a communist country, people were fleeing. So some people went to Scandinavian countries like Sweden, but most headed for Germany. Because at that time it was already past D-Day, and so that the Allied victory over Nazi Germany seemed imminent. Our journey took us to a small town in Bavaria where we lived in a makeshift loft in a barn. And often in the middle of the night we would hear sirens, and my family would hurry to the nearest bomb shelter, which was in the cellar of a neighbor's house. And there we huddled against the cold stone, damp walls, and, you know, among sacks of potatoes and farming tools.
Yeah.
And at first it would be a low rumble that would get louder and louder until it would be this ear-splitting screech above us. I would hold my hands over my ears and try not to breathe. And it was American and British aircraft that was bombing Germany. They mostly targeted military sites and industrial sites, but they also hit civilian areas.
Yeah.
After the war ended, the Allied countries divided Germany into 4 zones and set up displaced persons camps for all the refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees who had fled from their homes all over Eastern Europe, and of course then could not return to their homes. So for the next 5 years, we lived in a DP camp in Ansbach. It was in the American zone. And it was a difficult time. Whatever economic or academic advantages my parents had had before were gone. All the refugees lived in the same humble circumstances. Lacking almost everything, they improvised. They learned to improvise. A tin can with a wire handle served to bring soup from the communal kitchen.
Yeah.
I remember that my father made sandals for us by cutting up a tire. It was a tire from a military truck, a tire that had been discarded. He cut it up and made sandals for us. Worn clothing was mended over and over again. So, but worst of all was that my parents and all the other people had lost control of their lives.
Yes, yeah.
And they would wait a long time for the bureaucratic process to determine their future.
Yeah, that, I'm struck by how that memory is etched in your mind and the level of detail in your telling it, and even more details in your book where you tell it, because what a traumatic event to have happen. And you mentioned the loss of control. That's what struck me when I read about it in your book, and as I hear you talk about it, to suddenly, through no intention of your own, to have your entire life, everything that gives us a sense of stability and continuity just totally taken away, disrupted, and then not to know what the outcome is going to be, and not to be able to just have to wait for the bureaucratic wheels to unfold, and how beyond unsettling, terrifying at times that would be for adults, much less children, because children have less control than adults always. And so it's such a dramatic story and traumatic story, Dag. So thank you for filling us in on that, because as we were talking a little bit, if we don't repeat history and study it and think about it empathically, it disappears. And it's so important for us not to disappear, not to lose these kinds of history, because there are so many lessons for us. But in a personal way, then, I wanted to ask you, there are a lot of poignant analogies in your book. And in one of them, you draw a comparison between these, what you call meager years in the camp, and the tree rings that will remain in a tree after there are traces of drought and poor conditions, even after the environmental conditions have improved for the tree. And so I wonder how you feel that these tree rings, so to speak, of your personal history remain embedded, even though your environment has changed enormously.
Yeah. Yes, I did use that as an analogy, because looking at a cross-section of a tree trunk, you can see that the annual rings vary.
Yeah.
Some are wide, some are narrow, some have marks on them. And years of abundant rain will make abundant rain, and sunshine will grow wide rings.
Yeah.
But narrow ones suggest that there might have been a drought, there might have been an insect infestation, or a dark smudge might indicate that the tree had been in a forest fire. So if we could visualize the cross-section of our lives, perhaps we could trace the effects of meager years, traumatic years, and peaceful years, and how they affected our growth. So once grown, a tree's rings can't be undone. They're there permanently. So in a similar manner, the impact of stressful events in our lives too are embedded in us, and those experiences are etched in our memories. So when I started writing this memoir, I made a list of things that I wanted to write about. And later when I looked at the list, it really surprised me that the things that I wanted to write about all had an element of fear in it.
Yeah.
And fear is such a strong emotion that unless surprised, those frightening experience, leave vivid memories, and they can persist over the years. Long forgotten emotions can suddenly well up and in an unexpected kind of way. So other people, for instance, other people who have experienced bombings will tell me that years later, hearing a siren of a fire truck or a police car, they would cringe and
Yes.
relive that same fear.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it. But how important to understand what made those tree rings, what formed them, so you can understand later in life, oh, it's a fire engine, or oh, it's a police car. But in my mind, there's a rapid fire association with there were literally bombs going off in your environment.
It's almost an emotional response,
Yeah.
in that you're not really conscious of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're powerful tree rings, embedded for life. Well, Dag, I also wanted to ask you about, now your family wound up, after the bureaucratic wheels turned, your family wound up coming to America and landing in Cleveland, Ohio. And you talk in the book about the push and pull of assimilating to American culture or remaining in ways that you could true to your Latvian culture and roots. And this struck me when I was reading your book. It's such a perennial experience for immigrants to this country, and we're all immigrants or children or grandchildren of immigrants. So you could say that this push and pull is a defining feature of being an American, actually. So when you look back on this push and pull of your life, what do you see as its tree ring or its formative or lingering impact on your life?
Yes, eventually my family settled in Cleveland, Ohio, and I think my parents chose Cleveland because there was a large Latvian community there.
Yeah.
So, and by that time my father had a well-paying job, and he bought a house for us on the west side of the city. Understandably, my parents were afraid that over the years my sisters and I would forget our language, forget Latvian culture, forget Latvian customs that were very dear to them. They didn't want us to forget that. So they insisted that we join Latvian Girl Scouts, that we, on Sunday mornings, that we go to Latvian school, and that we participate in all the Latvian community activities. And that we would form friendships with Latvian youth, which we did. But as a teenager, attending Lincoln High School, I also had a circle of American friends. So I had two sets of friends, my Latvian friends and my American friends. And the two sets stayed separate. The two worlds never intersected. And I felt like I was beginning to lead a double life. So at the dinner table, in the evening, my father would very often, he would begin a sentence with, "in the old country." And then the conversation would turn to comparisons between life in Latvia and life in Cleveland. Uprooted more than once, my parents found it difficult to put roots down in a new place, and their lives mostly centered around the Latvian community. And over the years, I think with patient resignation, they had settled into a status of refugees living in exile. I didn't want the status of a refugee living in exile to define me, to be the only thing that defined me. So I needed the freedom to explore other things, to find other things that would define me. So today, I mean, I can see how immature and how naive that thinking was, but I was 21 years old, and I had finished college. I left home. First, I went to teach in England, and later in Libya. I knew that the unknown can be frightening, but it also presents possibilities for new growth.
Yeah, possibilities that are different from being defined by the push and the pull or having to choose one or the other. Instead, you can choose yourself and your own development, which is freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I as I was listening to you talk about that, I was thinking about in my family, both of my grandparents on my mother's side immigrated to this country from Ireland, and my mother used to talk about one of her brothers in particular, just like you, he didn't want to be defined by Irish culture, didn't want to learn Gaelic, and just went off. And yet later in life, my mother used to talk about how he used to get mad at my grandmother. Why didn't you teach us Gaelic?
Yes, exactly.
So there's a kind of a developmental, there's a time in life later on. You're smiling, so this must connect you. When there's a desire to kind of go back. And one of my own brothers also felt that. We went on a family trip to Ireland, one of my brothers, my younger sister, and my mom and I, to go seek out the little tiny cottage on the west coast of Ireland that had been my grandmother's home. And my brother bought a camera, and he was all about, I want to learn all this, and never till earlier. It was a certain point, I think he was 40, midlife thing. But anyway, it sounds like that you connect to that as well. But I think it's not an uncommon kind of response to an initial kind of push-pull and finding your place. You want to fit in your new country, and yet later on there's a sense that part of who I am, one of my tree rings, is influenced by this culture. And I might know myself better if I know the influences on me, and so I want to study and understand now. So it's interesting, isn't it? Well, Dag, another defining feature of your life and the engine that propelled your memoir are your experiences among many, many different nations and cultures. The teaching jobs that you mentioned, you sought out in the UK and Libya, and later, after your marriage to a physician serving with the Foreign Service, that constant rotation of different countries that took you to 5 different continents. So your memoir enables the reader to experience people, culture, and history, sometimes ancient culture with some of the places your husband was stationed, and also you do write well about food. Maybe more revealing of me, but that was part of the book that I really enjoyed the cuisines of these different places. And you describe, in fact, in a kind of another poignant kind of analogy, that your husband at one point is hungry for the world, a hunger that you clearly also shared. And I wonder how, in hindsight, you understand the connection between that hunger for the world and that early dramatic dislocation of your life, uprooting you from the culture and the history that was Latvia.
Yes. Well, I was fortunate that my husband also shared the same hunger for the world that I did. And growing up in New York City on weekends while his mother stayed home and cooked, his father would take him and his older brother to all the museums in New York. And on Sundays, the family would seek out ethnic restaurants, and the boys were introduced to all kinds of various cuisines of the world. And sometimes I think that maybe that as a child visiting museums, when he would see African masks and strange hieroglyphs and Egyptian, that all those things kind of sparked a curiosity in him for the faraway cultures. My husband is a doctor, and after we learned, he learned that the State Department was hiring doctors to run medical units in some of the larger embassies all over the world. It just sounded like the perfect job for him. The medical units provide health care for families, for the employees of the embassy and their families. So we were thrilled when he was hired.
Oh, yeah.
By that time, I had already lived in 5 countries, and so had discovered that, the broadening perspectives of living among different cultures. Some of the chapters of my memoir describe the excitement of arriving at a new country, and I would press my face against the window in the plane that was circling and descending and try to glimpse what the land looked like far below, and try to imagine what our lives would be like in that country. Sometimes the arrival was disheartening. Upon arriving in Bangkok, I was frankly appalled. It had been a long and exhausting trip by way of San Francisco and Hong Kong. And in the taxi that we were taking from the airport to the city, I looked around me, and it was chaotic. The traffic snarled streets. The heat was unbearable, and all these buildings and shop houses sprawling. And it occurred to me that it crossed my mind that it had been a mistake to come to Bangkok. But 2 years later, when it was time to leave, I was really sorry to go, because bit by bit, the life in Thailand had taught me so many things. All the wonderful, unexpected delights of living in that country, the lovely people. I wanted to stay there. I didn't want to leave. And I had loved living there, so it's very ironic sometimes what your expectations are and then how things change.
Absolutely. I think that's true often of many kinds of changes in life that we resist in the beginning, because I think what you observe are kind of external things, and yet once you're exposed to often the people, or you're more embedded in the situation, and you pay attention to things that are beneath the surface more. Inevitably, you're going to, because you're going to have conversations with people, you're going to make decisions about things, you're going to experience daily life in a place. And also, you develop relationships. That comes through in your book. Clearly, wherever you go, you wind up developing relationships with the people around you. So I'm not surprised that it transformed you from a questioner to a, no, I really love it here. So, well, you know, there are so many compelling stories and about your travels and your encounters in your book, and we can't possibly talk about them all. But I was hoping that you might choose one or maybe two encounter stories, basically, that give an experience or a lesson that stands out to you today, as you just did about the transformation you experienced arriving in Bangkok and then growing to love life there. Maybe one that feels relevant to where you are in your life right now, or simply one that you find yourself still reflecting upon today.
Yes. It's a tough one, and because there are so many.
Yeah.
But I often think about a camping trip we took in Ethiopia with good friends. Our two children were with us, and they had three children, one of whom was a baby. So in a Land Rover, we drove to a very remote part of Ethiopia where the roads were not paved, and we were bumping along on dusty roads and potholes. And at one point, in a barren plateau, we had stopped by the side of a road, and we saw a woman approaching us, and she was carrying a baby, and she came towards our vehicle. And it looked like she was begging for food. So we were looking around for something to give to her. And my husband said, "Don't open the window. The baby has smallpox." And we were shocked and we saw that the baby's face was covered with pustules. And my husband explained that smallpox had been eradicated worldwide, but not in Ethiopia. That 20,000 cases of smallpox had been recorded the previous year. So it was a very grim moment where we looked at our healthy children and realized, how privileged we were. So, and not long after that camping trip, my husband was invited to visit a clinic up country, and he invited me to go along with him. And after hours and hours of driving, we finally got to the clinic, and we noticed that there were lines and lines of people waiting outside for medical treatment. And we went inside. It was a small clinic, and there was a shelf with a handful of medicines on it. And just the grim reality of it really struck us, that all these people who had come a long distance, many of them probably with acute ailments, would walk home with no medical treatment, and their babies wouldn't survive.
Yeah.
Another trip, again, this was also in Ethiopia. We went to some remote country area where there were some lakes. And we stopped at the edge of a lake and we watched children splashing in the water and bringing in fishing boats. And my husband said, our children can't go wade in that water. And he explained that some of the lakes in some of the areas of Ethiopia harbored snails, and these snails carried schistosomiasis.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And of course, we saw these children and these men, and they didn't know about the connection between snails and the disease.
And the disease.
What comes out of all these stories is that I think how privileged we are to have the medical knowledge, to have our vaccinations, to have our medicines, our health care. It was really a striking moment.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, there are a lot of stories, and your husband's profession, of course, led him to encounter the illnesses in different places and the conditions of medical care outside the embassy. And I was struck by exactly the theme you're talking about, how privileged we are in the United States to have such good health care. And we often take it for granted, I think, and don't think with much awareness about the situation in other countries where they don't have the kind of resources for some of the most common kinds of illnesses that are so preventable, but none of us have to get them anymore, but like with the example of smallpox in Ethiopia. So it's a real, I think that's an important theme in your book that comes through, and I know this seems like a good moment to mention that I noticed on your website that portion of the proceeds of your book will go to Doctors Without Borders. So anyway, I wanted to ask you, because it's a question that I often think about and have not come up with a fully satisfactory answer, but the idea of home, and what does home mean? But you're somebody who I expect will have interesting thoughts and reflections and maybe can answer this for me. But Dag, given the life you've led with that, you had a home in Latvia, if that's what home means to you or meant, and then you had to leave it, and then you went off on your own, and then you traveled around the world. So I'm curious to pose this question to you. What does home mean to you?
Well, it is a question that I have pondered very often. Of course, home means different things to different people.
Yes.
It could be a family home somewhere. It could be a town or a neighborhood or even a circle of friends that you've grown up with. So in all the countries that we lived in, we tried to create a home for ourselves and for our children that was welcoming and comfortable. I once asked my husband where home was for him, and he said, home is where family sits around and sits down to have dinner.
Good answer.
But I want to address the questions in a more abstract manner. For me, there is no longer a family home. And I've lived in dozens of different countries, and there's not one place that I would or could call home because there are just too many. So I think about a quote that I read in my book. Or I read it, and it's cited in my book, and it was written by a contemporary artist. And it helped to define what home means to me. The German artist, his name is Anselm Kiefer, was born right before the end of World War II. His city was bombed, so he grew up around with the devastation and disruption of wars. And as an artist, his entire body of work is devoted to processing the memory, processing what it means, what war dislocations mean. And for him, home is, and I quote, "I believe above all that what I wanted to build, the palace of my memory. For my memory is my only home." So perhaps my home too is my memory. And it comes with me wherever I am.
Yes, that's right. It's portable.
And writing the memoir helped me to capture the experiences that I wanted to share, and that I hope that my memoir will take the reader along on my journey.
And it is a journey of home. Thank you for that. That's a great quotation. I love that. Yeah, it's very, very, I'm going to think about that. It's very thought-provoking. Well, you know, Dag, at the end of the book, you talk about your memories and your years in so many different countries as fragments. I'm quoting you now, out of order. Collections of smells and sounds that evoke certain isolated moments, bits and pieces, memory flashes. But now, you say, as you look back, you can see the intricate and rich pattern. I can see the connecting thread, you say. So, Dag, what pattern? I know this is a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What pattern does your memoir at long last reveal to you?
Well, there have been many connecting threads, as I said, and actually varied patterns, but there is a pattern, and wherever I lived, I was always struck by the generosity of people. And even more importantly, the people's resilience, how their ability to overcome hardships and difficult circumstances and to go on with their lives. I learned that my World War II experience is not unique. So, more so than ever, the pattern of wars and dislocations continue with people leaving. They flee poverty and flee violence, and that vast numbers of refugees who are leaving their homes and try to find better lives. Unfortunately, a refugee's life is about loss and loss of many, many things. So what I worry about is the children. Among it, and the upheaval, and how this upheaval will affect them for the rest of their lives, how it will shape them. And I hope that they will be able to grow up and process these memories, and that they will somehow help them to overcome whatever traumatic stresses they had, and help them build better lives.
Well, you know, I'm struck by your use of the word resilience, because that's a word that kept going through my mind with every page of your book as I read it, because it is a story of resilience from the beginning to the very end, because your family had this change, kind of were forced to become refugees, and yet you were resilient. You stayed in the barn, you sought shelter when you needed to survive, and then you went to Ohio, and your parents, you know, they bought a house, got work, you got an education, you maintained, music was an important part of your upbringing, that you remained true to that, and that's resilience of the highest degree. And that out of that resilience, you built a life of meaning and love and exploration and adventure, and you were generous enough to share that with all of us through your memoir. And so, yeah, I think that a book like yours also has lessons in it for people who may be in the midst of fear and doubt about the future and what it might hold for them, that it's possible when you endure, when you have resilience, and when you also lead, as you did, with a quest to discover who you really are and to be true to that person that you really are. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think your book is an inspiration, Dag.
Thank you.
And so thank you for writing it. Dag, is there anything that I haven't asked you to talk about this morning that you want to be sure to pass along to readers or listeners before we end this morning?
Yes, I want to mention the photos in my book. That morning in August of 1944, when my mother was leaving the home that she would never see again, she hurried around trying to pack all the practical necessities that she needed. And she also grabbed bundles of photos, decal-edged black and white photos that she stuffed into the bulging suitcases. Snapshots of christenings and family outings. Dear faces that she might never see again. She wanted to have these captured moments so that they would not be forgotten, that we would remember them. And some of those photos are in the book. And my father was an accomplished photographer, and he took countless of photos of us when his 4 daughters when we were young. And as I looked through the photos for this book, I became aware that very often he left out the drab and the miserable of what surrounded us during those war-disrupted lives in the beginning. For the most part, the photos reveal happy children doing typical things, like walking in the woods or dressing up or playing a musical instrument. And I think that my father wanted us to remember our childhoods as happy ones.
Yeah.
That's Father's gift to us.
Yeah. A wonderful gift, especially since those photos are a foundation for your memories. And as you just were very eloquent about, memories, the palace of memories winds up being home. So it helped construct your home in your mind. Well, thank you for that, Dag. Well, Dag, we're running out of time for today, but thank you so much. As you can tell, I really enjoyed your book, so thank you for writing it. And thank you for coming to the morning show to share these amazing stories of your life with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book.
Well, it's my pleasure, Dag. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, be well.